It's a privilege to be here, just to sit in the audience and watch great men such as Joe Rigney and Joel Webbin and great professors of great universities and YouTubers and pastors. I'm not any of those things. I'm really a guy who lives out in the woods. Don't have any of those special fancy titles, but I am a father, and I want my children to live in a Christian nation. So I am thankful for all of you for being here, for listening to me talk, and being patient with, I guess I give detailed definitions. That's what Joe Rigney said. But again, thank you for being here. So nothing about our thinking on ethnicity is normal. We Westerners are weird. We are unlike the rest of the world. Most people around the world, whether Christian or not, have a distinct people, some group to which they strongly belong, which has outgroups and often enemies. The strong feeling of peoplehood is true for a significant portion of those who even make their living in the United States, whose bodies are in the US, but whose hearts remain in Mexico or Africa or the Vatican or the Levant. A nation of immigrants can be nothing less than a hodgepodge of groups from somewhere other than the soil they currently depend on. America, in this conception, is the universal place, a space for everyone, a no place. It is good only because everything about it is derivative. Nothing is from here except the Native Americans or American Indians, the only people group granted true rootedness with that term native, or Latin for born or arisen. America is a land for people whose place lies on foreign shores, and to be truly American is to fight and even die to make this land a no place, a geographic space, an economic zone for any and all. There is no distinct American ethnicity, a distinct people and place, so we're told. America is the universal nation. It's rendered good not by settled hearts, nor by a culturally bound people. It requires that you affirm some universal abstract propositions, say that everyone gets to decide for himself the meaning of existence. But that's basically it. The deeper meaning of life, the sort of things that the heart owns, such as ethnic identity, cultural particularity, or a strong connection of people and place, must be supplied or rooted outside of America. Thus, the true Americans in New America are the hyphenated Americans. In a sense, these people are more complete human beings than the unhyphenated. Why? Because they have settled hearts with a people and a place, albeit a foreign place, while the unhyphenated have no place of their own. But we, the unhyphenated, those who trace our ancestry to Western Europe, whose roots extend beyond the Immigration Act of 1965 and Ellis Island, and which unite to this soil, we, the white Anglo-Saxon Protestants who founded, built, and died for and led this country for most of its history, we are not permitted in this new America to have a people or a place that is distinctly ours. There's no distant place that we call home. We have nowhere else to go. But this is our home. This is our native land. We are Native Americans, born of those who didn't immigrate, but who settled here. We are the sons and daughters of the people who settled this land. To describe America as a nation of immigrants, writes the great Harvard political scientist Samuel Huntington, is to stretch a partial truth into a misleading falsehood and to ignore the central fact of America's beginning as a society of settlers. Yet the country that our ancestors built is no longer for us, for those whose hearts are settled here like us. It is not for those whose people are old stock Americans, whose people as a group were generated before, during, and soon after the American founding. We are not permitted to identify with this ancestry in any strong sense, at least. We cannot call ourselves heritage Americans. In a word, you cannot have a people like everyone else. And why is that? Because through them you could lay claim to this country. Indeed, the whole point of the nation of immigrants trope is to render the old stock American claim irrelevant and anti-American, and even to elevate the hyphenated over the unhyphenated as more American. To be sure, we are allowed to have a people to which we act for good, and this speaks directly to one main point of this talk. The people we are granted and unthinkingly accept is composed of all people, anyone and everyone who is here, who fits within the geographical boundaries. That is, our people has been universalized, leaving us nothing positive that is exclusively ours, unlike everyone else who retains full rights to a shared particular feeling of people and place. The sociologist Eric Kaufman calls this asymmetric multiculturalism. It refers to social arrangements in which every ethnic identity deserves celebration except any white ethnic identity. In my view, this is just what multiculturalism is. It is inherently asymmetrical by design. We should distinguish it from the idea of multi-ethnic, in which various ethnic groups exist under the same civil polity. There's nothing new in that. It's old. However, multiculturalism, as Paul Gottfried defines it, is when the state glorifies differences from the way of life associated with the once majority population. It hands out rewards to those who personify the desired differences while taking away cultural recognition and even political rights from those who do not. As defined here, multiculturalism is the official policy of the American regime. It is reflected in everything from the protected classes and application of civil rights law to the accepted societal rhetoric around race and ethnicity. Everyone but white people can self-consciously and publicly have a bounded people and place for whom they openly act for their good. Now, white people in the Western world, and this is crucial, are their own in-groups, out-group. I'll say it again. White people in the Western world are their own in-groups, out-group. So what do I mean by this? First, an in-group consists of those to whom you direct your affections, your thoughts, your principal actions for their good. And an out-group may or may not be hostile, but it consists of those to whom you do not ordinarily direct your affections, thoughts, and principal actions. Now, the in-group for white people, as I said earlier, is composed of all people. If you are human, you are in. Our in-group is not white or Anglo-Saxon. It extends to all. So keep that in mind. It's a very important point. But we must begin to recognize that we are the out-group of that in-group. We are the hostile out-group. We are our history's oppressor in this schema. The old stock Americans, the old stock Americans, the group from which all others are, the old stock Americans are the group from which all others had to overcome to gain their freedom. We are our own nation's villain. Thus, our in-group, which again is universalized, is full of protected classes, and they need protection from whom? Why are they protected? They're protected from white people, or more specifically, from the white heterosexual male. Now, seeking the good of our in-group, which again extends to all people, it's not just whites alone, is precisely found in villainizing ourselves. It effectively makes us the out-group of our own in-group. We are the villain of our own in-group. Thus, we ourselves are the obstacle to our in-group's flourishing. And the entire American regime and all acceptable public discourse follows and confirms this. It follows that we as a group cannot stand up for ourselves. Take even a recent positive development in opposing anti-white discrimination in university admissions. University admissions, by the way, when they seek to create a diverse student body, must discriminate against white applicants because whites are second only to Asians in grades and test scores. Almost every diversity program must, at least in effect, harm white people. Diversity, whenever you see diversity, it is code for fewer white heterosexual men every single time. It's the diversity is the euphemism for fewer white heterosexual men. Every time you see it, you think fewer white men. Maximal diversity is the absence of the straight white man. Given the sheer number of white applicants for college admissions, whites are the most discriminated against in college admissions. But how do we respond? If we respond at all, how do we argue against this discrimination? Not by referring to discrimination against us. Indeed, we cannot see ourselves as a distinct group, so we can't be a protected class. What do we do instead? We point to discrimination against Asians. In recent Supreme Court cases, this is precisely what has happened. There were cases brought against UNC Chapel Hill and Harvard, and they were brought on behalf of Asian Americans rather than whites. This despite the fact that whites are, as I said, far more subject to discrimination. Jeremy Carl, the author of the book, The Unprotected Class, which I highly recommend you all buy, the Unprotected Class, he writes this, that Asian American students would be seen as a more appealing client to a Supreme Court with no Asian American, but stocked with a majority of white conservatives is a very revealing window into our racial politics today. Now, the media took notice of these kind of racial dynamics, and one professor, cited by Jeremy Carl, said that all research shows it's Americans who would benefit the most, ruling against factoring race in admissions. Now, of course, the professor, as we might expect, was saying this is bad because when white Americans benefit from policies, that is bad. Anything that benefits whites is bad, even if it comes from treating everyone equally. Indeed, once you're aware of this rhetoric, this rhetorical move, that basically any policy that benefits whites is bad, you'll end up seeing this everywhere. It's a basic, fundamental point of argument. Indeed, like a policy is bad if, in the end, the effect would benefit whites and not others. So, and that's because anything that harms whites for the good of non-whites is good, and such harm is questionable only if it also harms non-whites. So if university admissions only harmed whites and not Asians, would anyone fuss about it? Probably not. Would anyone care if you did fuss about it? Probably not. In fact, you'd probably be called a racist. Actually, I'm sure you could be called racist. What I'm describing here is not simply the views or the rhetorical strategies of communists and socialists and modern liberals. This is the rhetoric of American conservatives. It is practically universal. Even for conservatives, whites are their own in-groups, out-group. So take the typical conservative's narrative of American history. The conservative narrative is actually far more progressive than the left-wing progressives narrative. Kind of ironic there. In essence, America, according to the conservative historian, has overcome the dominance of the white Protestant male, as we've slowly extended rights to non-whites and non-males. That's what their history kind of covers up, and in fact, that's what it says. The overarching theme is that the American founding issued a promise, and the white male fulfilled that promise, or is fulfilling that promise, by overcoming himself. Fulfilling the promise of the founding is simply the positive way of saying that white males overcame themselves. Most conservatives will simply pick a recent year from which to command history and say, stop progressing. But inevitably, one of their buddies, a highly respected friend, someone like Jonah Goldberg, will write the conservative case for article, and then the conservatives will update their timeless principles, ensuring that they remain the controlled opposition. That's what they've always been. Of course, this doesn't stop the progress. When you have a narrative built on progress, it never stops, nor do the updates ever stop. They continue to update. There's the conservative case for this, or trans, or whatever. It never actually ends. The progress never stops. Thus, even for conservatives, white people are their own in-groups, out-group. And the conservatives' historical narrative assumes and perpetuates it. Again, fulfilling the promises of the founding, promises made by your ancestors to all, requires you to assume that ancestral promise. You assume the promises of the founding as your own. And then you have to identify with your in-group, everyone else, and then you have to cast yourself and your ancestors as the villains of that history to overcome yourself. And also, conservatives then say essentially that we're also the heroes. So we're the villains and the heroes in this sort of drama of American progress. But in so doing, you must affirm and celebrate everyone's diversity except your own. Again, you take upon yourself the burden of your ancestors' promise of equality and freedom, and you fulfill it by overcoming and villainizing yourself on behalf of all. You become the sacrificial hero, resulting in your displacement, a deracinated heart or rootlessness, and the loss of self-respect and a self-affirming people of your own. So multiculturalism is animated by what I want to call a sort of social pathology. It is pathology because multiculturalism is demonstrably bad for the majority by every measure and by everyday experience. And yet it remains, in the US and especially among the majorities of European countries, the central theme of policy and political rhetoric. What's incredible about this and what's so weird about it all is that even liberal academics have shown conclusively that multiculturalism undermines social trust. It distances people from one another. It diminishes social capital and civic engagement. Take this study from a few years ago at the Annual Review of Political Science. It looked at 1,001 statistical estimates on ethnic diversity in 87 different studies. And it concluded this is what it concluded. We find a negative relationship between ethnic diversity and social trust across all studies. The relationship is stronger for trust in neighbors when studied in more local contexts. And George Mason University economist Garrett Jones, in his book, The Culture Transplant, which I'll cite several times here, the message is clear. This is what he writes. The message is clear. When it comes to social trust, greater ethnic diversity is a weakness. Studies also demonstrate that ethnic diversity harms a sense of the common good. So one study concluded this: ethnic diversity seems to lead to a shift from public spending on public goods to the public provision of private goods, arguably because the latter can be targeted to particular ethnic groups. Now, let me explain that. Ethnic unity and cultural homogeneity correlates with the willingness to pay taxes for the common good, that is, for the sort of things that benefit everyone, such as good roads. But in a multicultural or ethnically diverse place, public spending is on ethnic targeted goods like scholarships or government jobs or business loans designated for particular ethnic groups. And all of this should sound very familiar. It's basically the Democratic platform today, which explicitly favors non-white ethnically diverse clientele with targeted programs, notably business loans, welfare programs, disproportionately used by non-white groups. We Westerners do not deeply appreciate how good we've had it, with a culture strongly opposed to corruption and graft and bribery and adamant about procedure following in civic institutions and bureaucracies. Though imperfect, we're still exceptionally altruistic. We follow the rules, we wait our turn in line, we don't cheat to get ahead, and we expect as a matter of moral principle that no public official has personal favorites for government services intended for all. But that way of life is increasingly vanishing. One culture shock you hear from American missionaries is the surprising toleration of corruption in foreign countries. It is almost ubiquitous. Missionaries often, they don't tend to want to tell you this, but missionaries often find themselves justifying paying off bribes since there's no other way to continue their activities. To get things done, say to register a vehicle or get permits or to avoid frivolous legal demands or threats of lawsuits, it is easier to pay a fixer who himself is not a government employee but is connected to a co-ethnic who can get the job done. This foreign way of doing things has arrived in America. One writer, Matthew Crawford, the author of a very good book, Shop Class as Soulcraft, recently wrote on his experience in the California DMV. So he wrote, and I'll quote a link because it's really good. He writes, in dropping the pretense of its ostensible mission of public safety, the official DMV was perhaps just acknowledging the reality of the unofficial DMV, the one that is likely to be called corrupt by people clinging to first world norms. Having now spent some time in DMV offices in the new California, my impression is that the shop floor operates along the lines of ethnic fiefdoms that overlap somewhat and work fairly smoothly together when necessary. The Hispanic customers speak their own language with a Hispanic teller, the warm tones and easy gestures of which seem very unlike the bureaucratic mode of address that institutional English is adapted to. There are other languages spoken as well, each with its own characteristic emotional repertoire, and some of these seem better adapted to the haggle, at least to the naive and suspicious ear of one feeling beset by a cacophonous babble. You, reader, might be scandalized by the ways of California's DMV, but such response is a hangover from another era. Under conditions of bureaucratic dysfunction, corruption isn't a problem, it is the solution. These new populations have found a way to get things done. Bribery is more efficient and far less crazy-making than clinging to first world expectations in a world that has changed, end quote. What this speaks to is not simply the natural results of bureaucracy amidst multiculturalism. It is the quite predictable failure of assimilation of foreigners into Western norms of altruism, universalism, and proceduralism. Social scientists have shown quite conclusively that immigrants in the West retain the values of their ancestral homelands. Again, Garrett Jones summarizes the findings. On average, hyphenated Americans appear to get about half of their attitudes towards social trust from the land that comes before the hyphen, persisting even to the fourth generation. That's how far they've studied this. I mean, the ethnocentrism of many people here will simply not diminish. Thus, Indians in America, having a strong documented culture of nepotism and ethnocentrism, will hire their own, even abusing the H-1B visa program as we see in the tech industry. Furthermore, the values that tend towards lower socioeconomic performance will endure for generations. In short, if you import the third world, you get third worldification. This is not far-right rhetoric. This is statistical fact. There is every reason to believe that the importation of tens of millions through the southern border will create a socioeconomic underclass that will over time shape our institutions into those of their ancestral lands, the same institutions they're fleeing from. That is into ethnic privileging, corruption, procedural dysfunction, and most importantly, the utter failure to serve the actual common good. Instead, you get perfunctory licensing and certification, shoddy structural inspections, unreliable contracts, meaningless and dangerous credentialism, class-based politicking, and the weaponization of the legal system. We've already seen some of that. So let's bring this down to earth a little bit. The most beloved of American cultural practices, one that you may not know sets us apart from much of the world, is the American culture of smiling and of acknowledging the passerby and strangers. Do you know that we're weird? People think they make fun of us for that. That pleasantry makes the public pleasant. It makes a livable and welcoming space. It feels like a duty to us. You see a stranger, you cross by, you acknowledge him, especially in the South. What Edmund Burke once called the decent drapery of life that beautify and soften society will be dissolved, making the public a space of cold and gray utility. What was once the predicted consequence of capitalism will actually be the result of multiculturalism, the eroding of that cultural practice, which you still see in places in the country, mainly in cities. So since 2010, researchers have begun to show that the people matter more than the place in determining social trust, prosperity, good governance, and technological advancement. This is certainly true of Southeast Asian countries with their strong Chinese minorities, always economically on top over the indigenous, no matter how long they've been there. It's interesting. You go to one of these countries and the people who own the business are all Chinese, while the majority is Malaysian or whatever. But this is also true of Europeans. The economists from Brown University, their names are David Weil and Louis Putterman, and really a path-breaking study in social science and political science, or I guess they're economists. If the only thing you knew about each nation on the planet was the fraction of that nation with ancestors of European descent, you would be able to predict 2/3 of all global income differences. That's as summarized by Garrett Jones. All right, so a growing body of research indicates that the people matter more than the place. So the point here is not to prove some sort of genetic supremacy or anything of that sort. It's simply to point out that regardless of the cause, the data show that descendants of Europeans produce more prosperous countries, and I will add better governance and technological advancement, rivaled only by East Asians, namely the Chinese. We can conclude, therefore, if we rely on reason and not on emotion, that reducing the European composition of any country, unless replaced by Chinese, will harm the well-being of that country and certainly undermine the Western character of their institutions. Now, most Westerners, at least implicitly, know this from experience, and they can access these studies. Like the liberals are the ones producing the studies. Sometimes actually they sit on their findings for years because they want to disprove it, but then they're honest enough just to publish it and do qualifications and all that. But it's out there. It's crazy. But at the same time, we have this Western, what I call, what other people have called Western ethnomasochism. Western ethnomasochism, which I'll define as the perverse thrill in experiencing cultural suicide. The perverse thrill in experiencing cultural suicide. This is radically new and is exclusive to our time. It would be utterly incommunicable to our forefathers, the degree that we do this. And guilt, it seems to me that guilt is the crucial factor in our weirdness, but it's not the sole factor. Guilt interacts with Western universalism and egalitarianism, the same traits that have produced our prosperity. But this proves to be a suicidal admixture. Westerners tend to think that they live in universal space, a purely human place, fit and suitable for all. We think that the capitalist system is not undergirded by strong cultural norms, that bureaucracy is a matter of universal reason and rationalization, that everyone has the same rights, which are easily taught and received, and everyone is equal and free. It's a human space, not dependent on a common way of life to function and endure. Thus, many ways of life can and should equally flourish, so we adamantly affirm, against really all experience. But guilt arises when these conditions produce disparities of outcomes. In response, we don't wake from our ideological slumber. We don't realize that the conditions for flourishing are not universal, but undergirded by a particular way of life, of a particular people. No, we blame ourselves for not establishing the universal, for not yet rooting out the implicit biases and our implicit supremacy in the system. So we utilize guilt to cope with the failure of our ideology to successfully universalize outcomes. Again, we are our own in-group's out-group. And instead of rejecting this ideology or recognizing that our way of life is what undergirds our system, that is, instead of affirming our in-group, our true in-group, our guilt causes us to reaffirm the universalist and radically egalitarian ideology, to double down. In psychological terms, guilt suppresses the cognitive dissonance between our ideology and our experience. For this reason, multiculturalism, among other destructive and delusional policies, continue. But the final resolution of this purification spiral is complete dispossession. What begins with dispossessed hearts will end with dispossessed bodies. Universalism and guilt together shape the way we morally evaluate ourselves and others. At the group level, you may ascribe to white people only negative qualities, but you may ascribe to non-whites only positive qualities. Now, any negative qualities found among non-white folks in terms of patterns and averages must be redirected and blamed on whites. And we take on the guilt for their moral crimes. That is, we blame ourselves. Their sins, we might say, are imputed to us, reckoned to ourselves, and we take them on willingly. We wound ourselves for their transgressions. Of course, this is all quite absurd when aired out in the open, but isn't this precisely what we find in public life? White guilt leads to self-accusation, which serves as the feedback mechanism that perpetuates and exacerbates the already failed policies of multiculturalism. So take the sex crimes in Europe, for example. They've soared following recent immigration from the Middle East and Africa. In Sweden, nearly half of those convicted of rape were born outside of the country. Yet the reception of foreigners continues. Another example, on New Year's Eve, 2015 in Cologne, Germany, during celebrations, around 1,200 women in the main square were sexually assaulted and robbed. The same happened in Hamburg and Stuttgart, and as Douglas Murray reports, in all those places, as they have almost everywhere in Europe, the police sought to conceal the ethnic identities of the perpetrators. And Murray writes, there appears to be a concrete official effort to suppress data about crimes where the suspects might be migrants. Recently, a German woman, Marie Theresa Kaiser, was convicted and fined 6,000 euros in a German court for, quote, inciting hatred. What did she do? She posted on social media the statistically established fact that Afghanis in Germany are heavily involved in gang rape. So if you post facts about protected groups, you must pay the price. All this comes after the infamous Rotherham child sexual exploitation scandal in which Pakistanis in England from the 1980s to 2013 assaulted thousands of teenage white British girls. The local authorities knew about it for decades, stretching back to the 80s, and they did almost nothing, fearing charges of racism. Even after a crackdown, which has resulted in only 46 convictions with most sentences less than 15 years, the problem persists. A report in 2022 says this: institutional hesitancy to intervene and take the necessary action to protect children. Did I say? Yeah, they are not. Yeah, there's institutional hesitancy to intervene and take the necessary action to protect children and catch perpetrators. Now, has the UK learned its lesson? Around 83,000 Pakistanis immigrated legally to the UK in 2023. Has Europe learned its lesson? No, mass migration continues. Even among the so-called far-right leaders in Italy, it still continues. In multiculturalism, as I've said, anything you ascribe to minority groups as groups must be positive. It follows that if any individual does something bad, he must be considered as an individual, not representative of the minority group. This is true regardless of the obvious noticeable patterns. In contrast, the majority group in a nation, in our case whites, are treated as disparate individuals when doing good things, or we say that their deeds are like the deeds of our acts of humanity. They're either individualized or maximally universalized. Their great deeds do not represent something about their ethnic group or race, but of course any evil they do is representative of their group, even requiring all of us to stop and reflect. So as examples of this, Derek Chauvin with his knee on George Floyd requires all of us to reflect on our involvement and complicity in racism. Meanwhile, Darrell Brooks, you may not even know that guy's name, a black man who drove through the Waukesha Christmas parade in 2021, killing 6 white people, including 8-year-old Jackson Sparks, a boy marching with his baseball team. Brooks was simply called a lone sociopath angry at his girlfriend. Just as last Monday, a black woman outside an Ohio supermarket targeted and fatally stabbed a 3-year-old white boy, Julian Wood. Next, his mother, who was also suffered injuries. The boy died in his mother's arms. A mother doing nothing but minding her own business. Will we take to the streets over it? Are we willing to notice at all or even denounce? No, this murder is just a crazy individual representing nothing but herself. However, the very few instances of whites murdering blacks occasions our national reflection, even when they occurred decades ago. You're required to reflect on the name Emmett Till every time you hear it, a black teenager murdered in 1955. But will anyone require you to remember the name Julian Wood or Jackson Sparks or any of the tens of thousands of whites killed by blacks over the last few years, decades? No. The far-right numerous cases of blacks murdering whites causes not a stir at all. The justifiable death of a black man by cops is a national event, creating new slogans and a new civil rights hero. While the execution style of white cops by black men generates no national buzz, only a local ceremony. There is something wrong with this. Do you not see how utterly perverse this is? Now, the intent here is not to resurrect black-white race relations. That's not the point of what I'm getting. I'm saying the rhetorical framework and the habits of the mind that lead to this sort of thing is emblematic of a much broader problem in the West. Here's another striking example of a majority-minority double standard. This is again out of Germany. I could choose a lot of examples out of Germany in recent years. In 2016, 3 migrants raped a German woman. At first, she lied about the ethnic identities, calling them German nationals because she didn't want to, quote, help firm aggressive racism. She then published an open letter to her attackers, and one of the paragraphs I'll read you here. She said, "I wanted an open Europe, a friendly one that I can gladly live in and one in which we are both safe. I am sorry. For both of us, I'm so incredibly sorry. You aren't safe here because we live in a racist society. I am not safe here because we live in a sexist society. But what truly makes me feel sorry are the circumstances by which the sexist and the boundary-crossing acts that were inflicted me make it so that you are beset by increasing and more aggressive racism. I promise you I will scream. I will not allow it. That this continues happening, I will not stand by idly and watch as racist and concerned citizens call you a problem. You are not the problem. You are not a problem at all. You most often are a wonderful human being who deserves to be free and safe like everyone else. Now look, we all know that's utterly insane. But I want to suggest that fundamentally, this psychology in more subtle forms prevails in the West, including in the United States. The Western civilizational ethos can be characterized by maximal openness to outsiders. Our civilization being nothing distinctive in itself, but a universal human space for any and all outside of it. And we as Westerners, as those who must embody this ethos, must likewise be radically open, to the point of being nothing distinctive in ourselves, having nothing of ourselves to self-affirm, be proud of, to recognize as uniquely ours. The great books of the Western canon, for example, they're not ours, they're humanities, chosen not because they are our inheritance, but on account of their objective universal worth. They are everyone's, so we tell ourselves. Thus, we have nothing that is uniquely ours, except a self-police duty to cultivate the places and things of the West for outsiders, for the great non-Western other, and for them to be something. So great is the Western malaise that we are great only insofar that they become great. We must decrease that they might increase. Our only good is doing good to the non-Westerner. And so our confidence, our self-worth, our meaning is tied up with those extra nos outside us. We live vicariously through the self-affirmation and the confidence of the other. In this sense, we are dependent on the non-Westerner to be good, on our self-assurance and confidence. We live through them. When humans have nothing of and for themselves, they find it from others. This is the function of the great white gaze, is a desperate and pathetic attempt to feel human. But let's focus back on America, okay? The post-World War II order brought in a new history of America, one that emphasized the U.S. as a nation of immigrants, a nation for any and all who will affirm the liberal propositions. But this narrative is false. The post-war period is an era of myth creation. The never again ethos, which rose to dominate after the aftermath of World War II, required that the political left and right affirm a new narrative of American history. In the US, this story is centered in part around two seemingly contradictory ideas: that the American political tradition is racist or contains racism and is marked by radical openness. Both the left and the right accepted versions of these ideas. The left believes that America is racist to its core, a racism that continues to manifest everywhere and explains everything. The left's solution to racism is radical openness through diversity, equity, and inclusion. Similarly, the American center-right the American center-right will dutifully recognize America's racist heritage, but insists that racism always contradicted America's core ideals, namely the universalistic, radical openness of the American founding. America has improved, according to the center-right, but only by fulfilling the promise of the founding, namely through radical openness, or in other words, diversity, equality, and inclusion. Thus, both the left and the right are fully committed to radical openness. The left defeats American racism through openness, and the right denies American racism with a historical narrative of progressive openness. They differ in their principles, but agree in the means and the ends. So central to this narrative is the idea that America is, at some level, a propositional nation, or at least it is a country whose unifying theme transcends ethnic and cultural difference. Indeed, the greater the diversity, the greater the theme's glory. The more that America looks like the multi-ethnic eschaton, the more marvelous and divine are its principles. Of course, ethnicity can mean a great deal to Americans, but only if their ethnicity lays no claim to be the core ethnos around which all others derive their Americanness. This post-war ethos explains why the conservatives in the 1980s sought to universalize or dehistoricize the Pilgrims of Plymouth Rock, making them the archetype of the cosmopolitan, freedom-loving, huddled masses that would come to form our nation of immigrants. Reagan's mythologizing about the city on the hill is old news. It's mostly false, seared permanently in the boomer's mind by cable television. But alive and well is the myth that Americans were never a singular ethnos. Any emphasis on identity rooted in intergenerational love and action for ourselves and our posterity is suppressed and considered un-American. It's denounced as nativism. America was never a nation of shared ancestry, blood, and religion, so we're told. Belonging to America has little to do with generational linkages of the dead, living, and unborn to a shared ancestral history. Rather, we're told that American unity is more universal history, committed to shared abstract ideals. One belongs by virtue of the creed. Now, this narrative seems innocuous enough. The overarching theme is altruistic action for humanity, with struggle against various forms of oppression. American identity is fundamentally the struggle against the abstract human oppressor. But it still renders the core American identity as a negative or oppositional identity. Being a good American is simply identifying and advancing the history of overcoming the oppressor. That's what it means to be an American. You identify with and you seek to advance overcoming the oppressor, this abstract. But we must recognize that the chief oppressor in this drama is, again, the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant. Or to update a bit, it's the white heterosexual man. His intersection of characteristics renders him the villain in every case of oppression in American history. And this is his only distinctive identity in American history. For the WASP, as we've been called, cannot have a positive identity, nor can he claim a unique and important connection to the American Anglo-Protestants of old, such as George Washington. Washington and all great American Anglo-Protestants of our history have been universalized, and thus they have become fathers of all. We are left with no heroes to call our own. But given the oppositional nature of the historical narrative, non-Anglo-Protestants, having been the oppressed, can exclusively identify with their ancestry. So one can be proud of being Black and Hispanic and Chinese, and they can have exclusive claims to certain American heroes, for example, Martin Luther King for Blacks. But this is denied to white Protestant Americans, whose potential heroes have been either universalized or villainized. They are not allowed to have a distinct people. Again, their in-group is all people. But since their ancestors were the oppressors in American history, they are their own in-group's out-group. Thus, they are connected to their ancestry exclusively, but only as the villains of American history. The exact opposite is true of all other groups. Now, we have to recognize that the turn against the WASP is kind of a dark irony. For there's truth in the myth of American openness. Americans have always been remarkably open and welcoming relative to the rest of the world. But until very recently, American openness was highly conditional. It required ethnic conformity. Indeed, American openness traditionally was not the toleration of radical difference, as many conceive of it today. It wasn't radical toleration, it was radical conformity. Foreigners became natives by becoming like the natives. American openness was the belief that foreigners, or at least their progeny, can assimilate into the American ethnos, namely into Anglo-Protestantism. Contrary to popular belief, there was an ethnic basis to American identity during the founding, which endured well after it, well into the 20th century. There was a dominant ethnicity. Furthermore, solidarity around this unique American ethnos was necessary to maintain America's universal principles. Ethnic particularity ensured the survival of our universal principles. In other words, culture undergirded the viability of the propositions. And this self-confident and dominant Anglo-American ethnos lasted well into the 20th century, and I think implicitly persists in American life to this day. Now, at the time of the American founding, the American population was 80% British and was 98% Protestant. Though there were distinct English cultural regions in North America, they were already becoming self-consciously American well before the American founding. So historians, very famous historians like Alan Gelzo and Gordon Wood, they've separately argued that the Great Awakening was sort of the initial cause of a type of ethnogenesis. It was called what Eric Kaufman, as I referenced him earlier, he calls it the early stages of a British-American self-consciousness. So the Americans at the time of the founding, they considered themselves part of the British political tradition. For example, in 1774, a document called Declaration and Resolves by the Continental Congress, it sought the recognition of their rights according to the immutable laws of nature and the principles of the English Constitution. They declared their rights as Englishmen, as their ancestors in like cases have usually done for asserting and vindicating their rights and liberties. Thus, they sought their rights according to the manner of their particular ethnic tradition, as Englishmen. We see here the universal and the particular, the latter being necessary to maintain the former. Old English liberties, codified and symbolized in the Magna Carta, were frequently asserted most earnestly by figures like Samuel Adams. The Declaration of Independence closes its list. I don't know if you've ever reached all the way to the bottom of the Declaration, but at the very bottom, it closes its list of grievances by appealing to British brethren, accusing the king of being deaf to the voice of consanguinity, that is, deaf to the voice of shared blood or shared ancestry. And of course, the preamble of the Constitution identifies the Constitution's chief end, the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity. Among the founding generation and well into the 20th century, Americans affirmed a sort of Anglo-Saxonism. You don't read this in most textbooks, linking the American spirit of liberty to the Saxon liberties of old. Thomas Jefferson was the most insistent. Americans were, quote, led by Hengist and Horsa, the Saxon chiefs from whom we claim the honor of being descended and whose political principles and form of government we have assumed. In another place, he wrote, has not every restitution of the ancient Saxon had happy effects? Is it not better that we return at once into that happy system of our ancestors, the wisest and most perfect yet ever devised by the wit of man as it stood before the 8th century? This animating myth that Americans were the immigrated remnants of the Anglo-Saxons was articulated by people like Benjamin Franklin and Charles Carroll, and later by popular 19th century historians George Bancroft and William Prescott. You find Anglo-Saxonism in the works of Walt Whitman, Henry Adams, Henry Cabot Lodge, Ralph Waldo Emerson, and my favorite, Jack London. Just read his book, Valley of the Moon, one of my favorite novels. You may not have heard it. Go pick it up, Valley of the Moon. Of course, Anglo-Saxonism is more myth than fact, but it speaks nevertheless to the idea of an intertwining of ethnicity, ancestry, and American principles, and it was affirmed even by those who insisted on the universality of those principles. Eric Kaufman, who I've mentioned a few times, he argues that American Anglo-Saxonism was even similar to the romantic nationalist ideas of later in continental Europe from people like Johann Herder and Hegel and Fichte. The one crucial question in the War for Independence was the possibility of political unity among the former colonies. We think this is just natural, of course. Of course you can get along, you're all Americans. But there was an open question. But as I said, there was a self-conscious Americanist prior to the war, but the war itself is what completed that unity. Indeed, their shared struggle was appealed to in key times to justify a stronger national government. So the most famous line comes from John Jay's Federalist II, and I'll read the relevant. He writes, a people descended from the same ancestors, speaking the same language, professing the same religion, attached to the same principles of government, very similar in their manners and customs, and who by their joint counsels and arms and efforts, fighting side by side throughout a long and bloody war, have nobly established general liberty and independence. So you see ancestry, you see same language, you see same religion, and also shared struggles in the same place. All of those together, John Jay argues, we actually, as these 19 colonies, can be the United States. Less known is George Washington. George Washington said something very similar when he was leaving his presidency in his farewell address. He's kind of the father of it all. He held it together. He knew that his person, I think George Washington was our first Christian prince and the model of the future Christian prince. But George Washington knew that he, as his own person, held these things together. And so in his farewell address, if you read it, he's appealing to the American people to say, I'm retiring, I'm done. I've served my country for decades, I'm done. You guys need to figure it out and make it work. And here's what he said, kind of near the end. He says, with slight shades of difference, you have the same religion, manners, habits, and political principles. You have in a common cause fought and triumphed together. The independence and liberty you possess are the work of joint councils and joint efforts, of common dangers, suffering, and successes. So cultural similarity along with shared action. So both Washington and Jay were not simply stating facts, but they were arguing for the feasibility of political unity by direct appeal to cultural homogeneity or cultural similarity. They were acknowledging this crucial principle, that cultural similarity is necessary for political unity. Affirming the universal propositions was not enough. So a lot of people that they bring out at this point, Alexis de Tocqueville, everyone's favorite French commentator on early America, he said that America is a society formed of all nations of the world. That's his quote, and everyone likes to talk about that. This is an exaggeration. Actually, at one point he says, there is hardly an American to be met with who does not claim some remote kindred with the first founders of the colonies. So we're not talking about of the country, the colonies. Like they would claim ancestry to the founders of the colonies. So contrary to Tocqueville's claim, the founders and Americans were not keen on diversity or immigration or ethnic difference. Franklin was famously hostile to the German immigrants. He even started, he wanted to Anglify them, and he started an organization, very, very subtly named, the Society for Propagating Christian Knowledge Among the Germans. Yeah. Now, to his defense, he actually thought they could assimilate fairly easily, but they had to be kind of prodded into it. And I'll add that they actually did really well. So a lot of people think that the part of the American ethnogenesis in the early republic was actually in part the Germans assimilating through intermarriage. So that actually did occur, and it wasn't until Catholic German immigration that things broke down. But anyway, ironically for our time, given recent pop culture, Alexander Hamilton was adamantly against non-Anglo immigration. So this is what he writes. He says, the safety of a republic depends essentially on the energy of a common national sentiment and on that love of country, which almost invariably be connected with birth, education, and family. Foreigners will generally be apt to bring with them attachments to the persons they have left behind and to the country of their nativity and to its particular customs and manners. They will also entertain opinions on government congenial with those under which they have lived. Or if they should be led hither from a preference to ours, how extremely unlikely is it that they will bring with them that temperate love of liberty so essential to real republicanism. So as we saw earlier, these obviously true and ancient claims are confirmed by social science. And finally, James Madison spoke of Americans as having kindred blood and as those who can live together as members of the same family. Okay, and later he said that he wanted to limit immigration to people who, quote, really meant to incorporate into our society. Okay, so all of these things, they come from the great political theorists of the American creed, but were they wildly inconsistent? No. While they affirmed that natural rights were natural and therefore universal, they believed that liberty was made possible by underlying cultural conditions. It is not sufficient to simply affirm universal propositions of liberty. In order for such principles to abide and produce concrete good in society, the people must be prepared for them. Take this striking statement from kind of a lesser known but still important founding father, Gouverneur Morris. Now, he's an ambassador to France in 1792. And he's talking about the French here, so keep that in mind. He says, in effect, time is needful to bring forward slaves to the enjoyment of liberty. Time, education. Everyone's French in here, they're probably offended. But what is education? It is not learning. It is more the effect of society on the habits and principles of each individual, forming him at an early period of life to act afterwards the part of a good citizen and contribute in his turn to the formation of others. Hence, it results that the progress towards freedom must be slow. The founders, though generally open, you have to emphasize, they're open and optimistic toward newcomers. They still affirm that culture undergirded the proper exercising of universal natural rights. Those who lack the culture cannot properly exercise the rights and will ultimately undermine the rights of others. Now, this view was likely the majority position in this country until perhaps 1965. And it lives on in many places unspokenly today and is reflected in immigration policy throughout our history. For most of our history, there was a core dominant ethnicity that was distinctly American. It was rooted in Anglo-Protestantism, and it was confidently dominant in that it demanded newcomers to conform to it. Some of the most popular and effective movements in the 19th century and the early 20th century were grounded in it. I'd argue that Booker T. Washington's work was part of this. And then going back a little bit more, the Know Nothing movement was widely popular and likely would have achieved significant success, usually identified as nativist, but they were really anti-immigrant. But it was kind of basically subsumed by the Republican Party, but still it wasn't rejected. That was actually widely popular and affirmed. It was just brought into the other parties, like so many third parties end up becoming. And to take what the great Princeton theologian Charles Hodge said. This is his quote. So you guys know Charles Hodge, great theologian. He said, "If it be then the distinction of Anglo-Saxon Christians that they are a Sabbath-keeping people, it is one to be highly prized and sedulously guarded. And in this country especially, we should be watchful lest the influx of immigrants of other nationalities deprive us of this great distinction and its blessing." So Charles Hodge is saying that we were a Sabbath-keeping people, and he's writing in the midst of a lot of Roman Catholic immigration, and we know what happened after that. A little later, Henry Cabot Lodge, someone you may not be familiar with, but he's kind of coming back in importance in some circles. He appealed to Anglo-Saxonism among old stock Americans to enact the highly restrictive Immigration Act of 1924, which was the law of the land until 1965. For some of us, that wasn't that long ago. As I said earlier, Anglo-Saxonism was on the minds of a diverse crowd, even people on the left. I mean, Jack London was a kind of a left-wing guy in a way. He talked about it, but it was also, any OPC guys here? J. Gresham Machen, the father of the Orthodox Presbyterian Church, in 1923, in the preface to his famous Christianity and Liberalism, said this: "God grant that there may come a reaction and that the great principles of Anglo-Saxon liberty may be rediscovered before it is too late." So I would argue the Anglo-Saxon ideal lived on even after World War II. In cinema, take like actors Clark Gable and Jimmy Stewart, who was a Presbyterian, by the way, and Gary Cooper. As Tony Soprano once said, "What happened to Gary Cooper, the strong, silent type? That was an American. He wasn't in touch with his feelings. He just did what he had to do." And then there's Gregory Peck, and of course, John Wayne. But let's suffice it to say that for most of our history, old stock Americans, which were both the majority and of the elite, believed that American was a distinct ethnicity, or at least contained the core dominant ethnicity of American society, rooted in the old world, especially in an Anglo-Saxon myth, but generated in the New World around the time of the founding and early republic. This ethnos was not simply the big one among others, but that into which all others ought to assimilate. And they rejected the melting pot idea. We should not use that language. It was an early 20th century idea cooked up by a Jew in New York who despised the confident Anglo-Protestant establishment. The melting pot idea subverts traditional American openness. Our ancestors believed that the American core ethnicity is best suited for the sorts of liberties recognized in the American founding. This animated American politics throughout our history. But as I said in my first line, today, nothing about our thinking on ethnicity is normal. We must, and this is very important, we must emphasize that Anglo-Protestantism is traditionally an open ethnicity. Now, this is not me being like a modern guy. This is historically true. We've always held that non-Anglo-Protestants can, over time, conform and become one of us. Dominant ethnicity is not opposed to assimilation. It is not a race essentialist ethnicity, nor something enclosed by genetic markers. People of non-British ancestry can become Anglo-Protestant culturally. Nevertheless, the openness is not an openness for radical difference, but an openness to the possibility of conformity. American openness says this is our homeland, and we welcome you on the condition of conformity. Still, we must recognize that in general, 20th century immigration, including Ellis Island generation, has been overall bad for this country. Indeed, our sprawling bureaucracy, rooted in FDR's New Deal, came largely from the Catholic European immigrants' preference for the welfare state. Helen Andrews, who wrote in The American Conservative, she says, "The closer we look at the New Deal, the more we see just how deeply entangled immigration is with the growth of the welfare state. This preference endures, which explains why Roman Catholics tend to vote for Democrats far more than white Protestants, even when they reject abortion. And while Roman Catholics since World War II have dominated the intellectual scene, it seems that the Roman Catholic energy now is on the side of welfarism, domestic interventionism, and European-style class struggle, which is exemplified by the Vatican Firsters at Compact magazine. As shown earlier, immigrants do not shrug off the values of their ancestral homeland on average. And those who have strong family values will still vote for welfare programs and social services over universal moral concerns like abortion and homosexual marriage. When your heart is planted elsewhere, your main concern here is for the things of the body. Foreigners, they tend to care more for the social services and the things that essentially free stuff than they would about the sort of national greatness that settled hearts would desire. Since Ellis Island, immigration was white immigration. The old America, the America of the old right that opposed the New Deal, is not a white thing. It's not a white thing, but is a distinctly American Anglo-Protestant thing, generated on these shores by a particular people. I'm not interested in white nationalism, nor limiting immigration to white people. White immigrants today will join the white Catholics in voting for Democrats. Doesn't matter where they come from. They're going to vote for the Democrats. Rather, old America lives on, albeit imperfectly, among white evangelicals who, as a voting bloc, remain the lone bulwark against the complete destruction of old America. Though to be sure, they do not stand alone. Conservative Protestants from many backgrounds have joined us in our efforts. These people are one with us, and they must not be excluded. And of course, we can work with Roman Catholics. But the fact is, we cannot expect immigrants, no matter where they are from, whether from Western Europe or anywhere else, to affirm American political principles, even after generations of residence. The heritage American and those consciously grafting themselves into that heritage are the last hope for old America. Let us further recognize that we are a Protestant people, which makes America a Protestant country. And so we must act in public as Protestants again. We must be Protestant academics, Protestant politicians, Protestant ethicists, Protestant intellectuals, Protestant voters. We must restore our confident responsibility for the America that is ours. We must shrug off the Stockholm Syndrome-like admiration we have for Roman Catholic and Jewish thinkers, who themselves are minorities, actually, within the Anglo-Protestant majority, who have dominated movement conservatism, and they've predictably been unable and largely unwilling to stop the slide of progress. To make America great again, America must again become explicitly and confidently Protestant again. All right. To this day, the core culture of America endures, though it is under threat. So again, Samuel Huntington, the great political scientist, he says this: America's core culture has been, and at the moment is still primarily, the culture of 17th and 18th century settlers who founded American society. The central elements of that culture can be defined in a variety of ways, but include the Christian religion, Protestant values and moralism, a work ethic, the English language, the British tradition of law and justice, and the limits of government power, and a legacy of European art, literature, philosophy, and music. All this must be reaffirmed and reinvigorated, and we are the people to do it. It must be and it must remain the norm of American public life. So let me conclude with scripture here. Revelation 7:9, after this I beheld, and lo, a great multitude which no man could number, of all nations, kindreds, and peoples and tongues, stood before the throne and before the Lamb, clothed with white robes and palms in their hands. So let me ask you a question. You, brother or sister, are in that multitude. Whom are you standing next to? Have you ever asked yourself that question before? Which nation of that great multitude are you among in that verse? Which nation are you in that verse? Some of you might be thinking, well, I'm quarter Irish. Maybe I'll be among the Irish. I'm a bit this or that too. But let me tell you whom I'm standing next to. I'm standing next to John Winthrop, Cotton Mather. I'm standing next to Jonathan Edwards. I'm next to John Jay, John Witherspoon, and George Washington. I'm next to Benjamin Warfield, Stonewall Jackson, and Calvin Coolidge. I'm next to Santiago Pliego, Antonin Scalia, Clarence Thomas, and Chocolate Knox. And finally, I'm next to Billy Graham, Jimmy Stewart, and R.C. Sproul. These are my people. So who are yours? Thank you.